The senator from South Dakota.
Mr. President, I would say to my colleagues who are here on the floor that this really is a defining moment for our country. The most basic responsibility and the most important priority we have as Americans is to defend the country. If we don't get national security right, the rest is conversation. We can talk about all these other things in the budget. We can talk about all the other priorities the country has, all of which are important. But if we fail to defend the United States of America, we have failed the citizens of this country. It is the #1 priority we have. It is the most important responsibility and obligation we have as public servants here in the United States Senate to make sure that we are taking the steps that are necessary to keep this country strong and secure from threats both here at home and abroad. Now, what happened is in really where we got to where we are today goes back to the fact that we haven't passed a budget for 3 years in the United States Senate. I need to remind my colleagues why we are where we are here today. The reason we are here is because for 3 consecutive years now, the Democrat majority in the United States Senate has not done the most fundamental responsibility that we have, is to pass a budget that addresses our national security interests. And so what did we end up with? We ended up last summer with the Budget Control Act, which was something that was cobbled together at the 11th hour to avoid a deadline on raising the debt limit, and we put in place a process where a super committee would look at ways to find long-term savings so that we could avoid the sequester. But the sequester was put into place as a result of the Budget Control Act, which was put in place because the United States Senate hasn't passed a budget now for 3 straight years. That is why we are where we are. Now, having said that, we need to fix the problem. And the problem, Mr. President, is that we have defense cuts that are going to cut very deeply into our national security interest. And you have the Secretary of Defense coming out and saying that these cuts would be devastating. The President's own Secretary of Defense has made statements to that effect. We'd have the smallest ground force since 1940. The smallest number of ships since 1915, and the smallest tactical air force literally in the history of the Air Force. That's the dimension of the problem that we are talking about as been described by the experts who are supposed to know these things. As I said, the President's own Defense Secretary has made these sorts of statements. Well, one of the problems we have, of course, is we don't even know what the full impact of this sequester will be because the administration hasn't put a plan forward. And we're awaiting that plan. And today the House of Representatives voted by 414 to 2 to require the administration at least to submit to Congress and to the American people how they intend to implement sequestration. So we at least have a better idea about what these impacts will be. Where are they going to make the cuts? By account. So that we can examine that and come up with a plan, hopefully, to replace those deep, unbalanced cuts to the defense budget with reductions elsewhere in the budget. But we won't know that because we can't get the administration to put forward the plan that we need to move forward with our proposals here in order to do away with what we think will be a very dangerous cut to America's national security. And so, Mr. President, I hope that the United States Senate will do something to address that by starting at least with requiring the administration, as the House did, take up the bill that was passed in the House, pass it here in the Senate, and require the administration to at least put forward a plan about how they're going to implement this sequester. And I would simply say that, as has already been pointed out by the senator from Alabama and others, that we're talking about basically a 50% cut in the defense budget, or the 50% of the cuts coming out of the defense budget, on top of $487 billion in cuts that were already approved last year. So we're talking about another huge amount of reductions up to about another $500 billion on top of what already is $500 billion in cuts that came last year. And remember that the defense budget, as has been pointed out, only represents now 20% of all federal spending. So we're going to take half of the cuts out of 20% of the budget. Now, where's the proportionality in that? And what we've done, essentially, and the senator from Alabama has highlighted this, is we have shielded many areas of the budget so that a lot of the things that some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle don't want to see cut are protected from this. But we're going to make huge, steep, draconian, and dangerous cuts in America's national military and national security budget. So I would hope that we can at least act on what the House of Representatives did earlier today by a 414-2 vote, pick up that legislation, require the administration to tell us how they're going to implement these reductions, and then let's go to work on a bipartisan basis here to try and come up with a plan whereby we can avoid what will be a disaster, as has been described by every national security expert out there, for our national security interests. We live in a dangerous world. We can't avoid that. The United States of America is looked to for leadership around the world. We have to continue to ensure that we can protect this country and America's interests around the world. In order to do that, we have to make sure that our military is resourced in a way that enables them to protect our interests. We cannot continue to go forward with this sequester, which would dramatically and in a very dangerous way harm those national security interests. As the senator from Alabama is correct, and that's one of the more remarkable things about this. The Commander-in-Chief, of course, is tasked with the responsibility of being just that, the Commander-in-Chief. And yet, when it comes to the national security interests that we have, and to at least spelling out how he would implement what we believe are going to be some disastrous cuts to the defense budget, he's not even informing us about what his ideas are with respect to that so that we can react to that. And more importantly, he doesn't seem to be the least bit interested in addressing this. And I think there's a huge silence coming out of the White House. The senator from Alabama is exactly right, and that's got to change. That's got to change if we're going to be able to fix this. And it starts by at least him presenting a plan. And you and I have introduced legislation in the House or in the Senate that would require that, much like what passed in the House today, and that's where it all starts. The news stories that have been printed here just in the last few days and the reporting on this subject has said that some of our colleagues on the other side have essentially concluded that this is leverage for them to get higher taxes. And it strikes me at least that there's a tremendous risk associated with allowing the country to go over a fiscal cliff, which includes not only these draconian cuts in the defense budget, but also tax increases that would occur on January 1st, to go over the fiscal cliff, risk plunging the country into a recession, raise the unemployment rate, which is already at a historically high level, all to prove a point about raising taxes. But that appears to be, at least by the reporting, there was a story in the Washington Post over the weekend which said Democrats threaten the fiscal cliff, going over the fiscal cliff, basically to get higher taxes out of the Republicans. That, to me, seems like a terrible trade to make, to risk the country going into a recession, to risk these tremendous cuts in our national security priorities, just simply so that they can get higher taxes.